Howdy folks, let's talk about the vocabulary of the sword. So any weapon we happen to have, be it a sword, be it a stick, be it a knife, be it a gun, be it anything, any tool in fact, we don't even have to limit it to weapons. All of them have a vocabulary. They are designed to do certain things, and we can do other things than what they're designed for, but generally they're kind of aimed at something when they're built. The screwdriver has a certain tip on it, assuming it's not adjustable, and it drives certain types of screws. It does not do a very good job trying to drive other types of screws. A flathead screwdriver generally won't drive a Phillips very well, and vice versa. So you need the right screwdriver for the right screw. Now, a hammer makes a really terrible screwdriver, but it does other things very well. It drives nails well, smashes things, whatever you happen to do with a hammer. So everything kind of has its own vocabulary in a sense. Sword is no different, okay? We have here a bokken, which is a wooden sword representing a Japanese longsword, a katana, which is a single-edged sword, okay? So some of these things might seem exceedingly obvious, but we don't think about them, so sometimes we miss some of the implications. Because it has a single edge, it's really designed to cut only with that single edge. It doesn't mean that we can't hit things with other edges, it doesn't mean we can't use the point, all of those sorts of things. The point's part of the vocabulary too. But in terms of cutting, it can only cut using a certain side of the blade because that's the only side that's sharp. Seems obvious. However, we have to think about that when we practice. So if we want to think of the full vocabulary of the sword, it involves everything that the sword can do. Okay? Some things are more likely than others, some things are more effective than others, and in a sense, we can do anything with anything, but that's kind of meaningless for us. So it helps to study the specific vocabulary of a weapon within a certain framework. Okay? So, that framework. As someone faces an opponent, it helps to think of a circle in a sense, of all the angles at which we can approach that opponent with an edge. We can come from the top, right? We can come from the bottom. We can come from diagonals, right? Doesn't matter. All of those are possible, okay? For the purposes of training, sometimes infinity is a little bit much to try and practice. So what's traditionally done is that the circle is broken up into 8 different angles. We do it in Western mathematics, 360 degrees. Even 360 is a lot. 8 covers the bases, and it provides enough dexterity, enough understanding for us to be able to fill in the gaps in a sense. So the difference between straight up and down, a diagonal cut, if we can do this and this, then we can probably do any of the parts in between, depending on what circumstance presents to us, okay? Again, in a sense, this isn't programming, but it kind of is in a way. We have these 8 directions, and we can adapt them to the minutiae of angle if circumstance calls for something different than one of the specific directions we've trained. Always remember that training is only a representation of what we're training for, in a sense. And if we want to get super philosophical, it's kind of good to think about what we're training for. Are we training for a sword fight as modern martial artists training in sword? Actually, we're probably not. The likelihood of us getting in a life and death sword fight is quite low. Okay? We can get into challenge matches, we can do sparring, those sorts of things, but it's never quite the same. Okay? So this training, though it should train us for a sword fight, and in a sense, because we're training with a sword, if we're not training for a sword fight, we're missing something. We have to keep in mind that actually this should give us skills and understandings and insights and feelings in the body and any of those types of things that you can think of. They should generate those things. This training should cultivate those things for almost all other areas of our life. This should inform how we interact with other people, how we converse with people, how we deal with conflict at work or in our family lives or stress in the world itself. Okay? So there's a lot to it. But let's get back down to basics. The vocabulary of the sword. Okay? So if we're going to represent the circle with 8 directions and we have a single edge on the sword, then it makes sense that this sword has 8 cuts. In reality, yes, it has an infinity of cuts, and we could come up with all sorts of other variations on things. But within this particular framework, it really has 8 cuts, and if you can do those, then you can do any of the other ones. Okay? Now with katana training, Kenjutsu, Iaido, Iaijutsu, Aikiken, any of those sword traditions, like everything, we're always kind of informed by what we see. We see in the movies, ha-ha, powerful cuts, big angles, great poses, right? Samurai frowns. Big things, okay? And those are useful. Again, what are we training for? If we're training to cut through armor, all of those sorts of things, then we need to develop power, absolutely. But let's start before that part. We're training without armor, okay? Where a cut is not a good thing to happen, even if it's small. Where contact with the blade is something that could potentially end the fight. Now, our vocabulary, our 8 cuts, okay? Instead of being quite big, we're not going to be doing big strokes here. We're going to keep it small, and I'm going to tell you a few reasons for that, okay? First of all, when wielding a weapon, it's always important to keep the weapon between you and the opponent. And that meaning has a little bit of spectrum to it. But just for the basic description of what's going on, the weapon stays between you and opponent. So if I draw back here, I've already broken that rule. We can see, if we think in terms of filling and emptying space, think of if we vacate space in physics or in space or in the world, then something fills it. Nature abhors a vacuum, right? If we pull out a bucket of water out of a pool, that space is instantly filled by water again. So as I lift the sword, I create a space here which naturally wants to draw something into this space. My weapon's not here to deal with something coming in. It's a perfect opportunity. We've all seen it in applications. As we draw up to cut, the stab comes in, okay? And we're creating it by physics in a sense. We're creating a vacuum in which something is drawn. This is the inhalation. Air wants to come into the lungs. Unfortunately, a sword might come into the lungs there too, okay? So if we're keeping the sword between ourselves and our opponent, why not practice that, even in basic exercises? So these 8 cuts that we're going to do are going to happen in front of us. They're going to happen in a smallish circle here, okay? If you think about someone standing in front of you, there's a certain circle in which the weapon is still pointed at that person, okay? And as that weapon starts to make a larger and larger circle, the opening starts to appear here, where now the weapon has to travel back in order to intercept something, okay? Where the weapon actually has to travel back even to encounter the opponent. And sometimes we have to do that to create power, but most of the time, it's better that the weapon be here. We can still cut just by advancing, okay? We can cut or stab with the thrust, which is always the more fatal attack, right? A couple of inches of this touches vital organs. A slash doesn't necessarily do that. It's bloody, it's painful, but if it doesn't go through ribs, then it's not doing anything. And again, are we going to be killing people with a sword? Do we want to do that? No, of course not. What we're doing is understanding what this was designed for, why it exists as a tool. And in our training, even to cultivate more esoteric things, we have to respect what the design of this is for. Just like having a screwdriver. It was designed for a Phillips screw head. If we start to think about other things it can do, we're getting away from why that screwdriver exists. Okay? Even if we are going to do other things with it, to know what that's for, what it was originally for, helps us understand that tool in other applications. Okay? This is getting wordy, isn't it? Yeah. So, 8 directions. Okay? So we're going to cut straight down, and then we're going to cut straight up. And we're going to continue this momentum in a circle around, cut to the right, cut to the left, continuing the flow of the circle. Cut upwards diagonal to the right. Continue the flow, upwards diagonal to the left. Here we're going to reverse direction, upward diagonal or downward diagonal to the right, and downward diagonal to the left. And you'll notice that that final cut tends to coil the body, and we're going to uncoil into a stab. Okay? Don't worry too much about the minutiae of how that stab comes out for now. Okay? As we uncoil, we can just come straight out of the hip. We can turn, right? There's all sorts of things that we can do. Don't worry too much about that. We're just going to let that cut fall and not let the point drop away, because again, we're creating this space in which we're quite vulnerable. Okay? Fall. The point is still towards the opponent. Should they charge at that point, it's only a matter of uncoiling the hip. Okay? Bang. Okay, so that's the end of it. So that's the 9th cut, the stab. So here we go. Down, up. Okay? Again. Vertically down, vertically up. Horizontally right, horizontally left. Diagonally up right, diagonally up left. Diagonally down right, diagonally down left, coil, uncoil. Okay? So, what does this cultivate for us? First of all, it gives us some dexterity in the wrists, in a sense. It encourages a looseness of our structure, of our connection to the sword. So these aren't, right? These are flowing, where the body leads the motion. If you look at the how this sort of propagates through the body, middle moves, which turns the spine, which turns the shoulders, which starts to pull the arms, which changes the orientation of the hands, starts to drag the handle through, and then the blade comes through. Okay? And so this is how we connect the sword to the body, in a sense. I think of it as if you've seen seaweed floating in the tide, where there's this kind of wave-like propagation through the body. Okay? It's something we can always work on. This looseness, this freedom of motion through the body. Think of it however you want. Freedom of chi, freedom of ki, to pass from the middle to the extremities. I think of it as lines of communication, in a sense. If something's blocking that line of communication, the message can't get through. Muscular tension is that kind of block. Or a hose. If we kink the hose, power does not get through this very easily. Okay? And it's not necessarily about power, but it's about freedom of motion. We can always add power later. And if the motion is propagated correctly, then the power appears by itself. Okay? So one more time. Down, up, left, right, upward diagonal, downward diagonal, coil, stab. Okay? And you can play with the size of the circle. Often this is treated kind of like a power tool, but in a sense this is a surgical tool. If you think about working this drill here, your access to wrists, to tendons, to undersides, to thumbs, to all sorts of little spaces in the opponent's grip, anywhere, you can get into those places if you think in this way. If you think only of chopping through them, that's a fairly crude way to frame swordsmanship in a sense. We can always do that. Everyone knows how to do that. You pass a sword to a kid, they know how to do that. What most people don't know how to do is to work these angles, okay? And it can go further. Like, these are just an implication of the angles available to you. But if you think about, we can take this blade edge and we can cut all the way backwards if we need to. And to be able to express these variations of vocabulary is important. It makes us versatile, it makes us well spoken in a sense. That's why the vocabulary metaphor is a good one in my opinion. We don't have to think of words, we don't have a crude vocabulary of a few grunts and shouts. We have a fluid vocabulary that comes out on its own, that is capable of conversing in any situation. And that's what this kind of work does. We want to be loose and flowing and adaptable. That's the whole point of all of it, really. It's not about imposing ourselves with the sword, forcing this tool onto the situation. It's about flowing with the currents of the situation, whatever they need, right? Whatever is required, we can come from any angle that we need to, okay? So in this practice, let's boil it back down to the mundane. Really good angles. Draw the 8 directions on a wall somewhere, or use vertical and horizontal references in your environment. Here I've got a horizon out there, and I've got some trees. So I've got a rough horizontal and some vertical, right? So precise angles as best as you can, okay? And then precise edge control. Don't let this edge, I know it may be hard to see on the bouquin, but don't let this kind of flop over in the middle of the cut. Think again, this is a cutting tool. This edge has to pass in the most aerodynamic fashion through whatever it's cutting through. So the whole zone in which the opponent could be cut, it needs to be cutting, and only at the end does it flip over and cut back. Same with these. The cutting happens on the angle. The edge is always aligned with the angle, okay? So really good angles, precise, really good edge control, okay? Play with the size of the circle. You can do it quite big if you want. Just don't hit the ground or the floor with your sword, of course, and that's fun. But I really encourage you to work this one. Small, okay? Small, fluid, curious in a sense, okay? This isn't about stay away from me, I'm a great swordsman. This is curiosity. This is, who are you? What are you saying to me, okay? What's in there? You know, we want a sense of wonder in a sense, a sense of curiosity, almost positive attraction in a sense, where it's like, I want to feel those tendons on your wrist. Oh, there they are. That kind of feeling, okay? Be willing to be adaptable. Be willing to let your grip roll, maintain positive contact. But this should be able to move in the hand, okay? Give it a try.